During a family gathering for our annual reunion, my father asked with concern, "Sweetheart, why did you arrive in a taxi?" He continued, "Is the car we gave you for your birthday acting up or damaged?" Before I could even answer, my husband smiled and said, "That car belongs to my mother now. She needs it more." My father was silent for a moment, and what he did after that made me truly proud of him. But before the story continues, please write in the comments what city you are all watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe so this channel, Revenge with Jain, can continue to grow and present even more interesting stories. The atmosphere at the main residence of the Harrison family felt both warm and grand. The large house, featuring modern colonial architecture, was filled with laughter and the aroma of delicious food wafting from the living room. This was a routine monthly agenda, a large family gathering that everyone always looked forward to. Luxury cars were lined up neatly in the vast courtyard, paved with natural stone, ranging from the latest aerodynamic sedans to massive SUVs worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Everything was polished, reflecting the sunlight that had been shining brightly before thick clouds suddenly covered the city sky. Inside the house, uncles, aunts, and cousins were enjoying a buffet served by the best catering service in the city. However, in the midst of the festivities, there was one empty chair at the main table, right next to Hudson. Hudson sat relaxed in the carved oak chair, not looking anxious at all while waiting for his wife, who had not yet arrived. Instead, he was busy enjoying the cuts of prime Wagyu beef on his plate, occasionally laughing loudly at a joke made by one of Claire's cousins. He wore a slick, silk designer shirt and a flashy gold watch, trying hard to look like he belonged with his wife's family, who were old money aristocrats. Hudson always felt the need to prove he deserved to be there, even though everyone in the room knew his position at the company was merely a gift from his father-in-law, Mr. Harrison. His attitude, which was often overly confident and slightly arrogant, frequently made several relatives feel uneasy. However, they chose to remain silent out of respect for Mr. Harrison, who was known for being patient and wise. Outside the towering gates of the estate, a dark blue taxi stopped slowly. Rain began to drizzle, wetting the hot asphalt. The taxi door opened, and Claire stepped out. The beautiful woman looked a bit overwhelmed. She had to reach into her bag to pay the fare in cash because the card machine in the taxi was broken. Then, she hurried out while covering her head with the edge of her bag so her modest attire wouldn't get soaked. There was no private driver to open the door, and no umbrella to welcome her. Claire jogged across the vast courtyard toward the porch, passing the rows of luxury cars belonging to her own family. Her breath was a bit ragged as she arrived at the large main door. She tidied her clothes for a moment, wiped the raindrops from her shoulders, and took a long breath to calm herself before entering the lion's den full of judging eyes. When Claire stepped into the living room, a brief silence greeted her before the sound of conversation buzzed again, though the volume had clearly dropped. Everyone's eyes were on her. Claire's appearance looked simple yet elegant, contrasting with the luxury surrounding her. Her face looked tired, with lines of exhaustion under her eyes that she tried to cover with a thin smile. She walked toward the main table where her father, Mr. Harrison, sat at the end as the head of the family. Mr. Harrison looked at his daughter with a sharp yet loving gaze. He noticed Claire's shoes were slightly dirty from raindrops, and the hem of her dress was damp. A father's instinct immediately kicked in, detecting something wrong that his daughter had been trying to hide. Mr. Harrison set his spoon down slowly, creating a soft clink that somehow sounded very sharp to everyone nearby. He looked at Claire, who had just respectfully greeted him, then turned to look at Hudson, who was still busy chewing without even moving or offering a chair for his wife. Mr. Harrison cleared his throat softly, enough to make the conversation at the table stop completely. With his calm but authoritative baritone voice, he asked a simple question that would change his son-in-law's fate forever. He asked why Claire arrived late and why his daughter looked soaked, as if she had just stepped off public transportation. This was despite the fact that he had just given her a very specific birthday gift for her comfort. Mr. Harrison asked with some wonder about the location of the latest Cadillac Escalade he had sent last week, asking if the car was broken so that Claire had to struggle to take a taxi in such unfriendly weather. Claire remained silent, her lips trembling slightly. She hadn't yet composed the right words to cover for her husband's behavior, because she didn't want to embarrass Hudson in front of the extended family. Claire was a devoted wife. She always tried to maintain her husband's dignity, even though her heart was often wounded. However, before a single word could come out of Claire's mouth, Hudson interrupted the conversation with his mouth still half full of food. With a very relaxed tone and without a shred of guilt, Hudson answered his father-in-law. He said loudly that the Escalade was now in the hands of his mother, Ruby. Hudson explained with a tone as if it were the most logical thing in the world, saying his mother needed the large luxury car for her social gatherings so she wouldn't be looked down upon by her friends. He added an argument that made the blood of anyone listening boil, saying that Claire, who only goes to the office and dresses modestly, should live simply and just use ride-sharing apps because it's more practical, and she doesn't have to worry about parking. The room suddenly became quiet, quieter than before. Uncles and aunts exchanged looks of disbelief. They knew the car was a personal gift from Mr. Harrison to Claire, his only daughter, not for his in-laws who were known for being obsessed with status. Hudson's words were not only rude, but also showed how much he didn't respect his wife and lacked self-awareness in front of the gift-giver. Claire lowered her face, holding back an overwhelming sense of shame. Not shame for taking a taxi, but shame because her husband proudly displayed his own ignorance in front of Claire's father. She gripped the edge of her scarf, wishing the floor beneath her would split open and swallow her right then. Her heart ached, hearing that her husband prioritized his mother's prestige over his own wife's comfort. However, Mr. Harrison's reaction was completely unexpected by Hudson. Claire's father didn't slam the table, didn't scream, and his face didn't even turn red with anger. Mr. Harrison just went silent for a moment, staring at his son-in-law intensely, as if observing a strange insect. Then a thin smile appeared on his lips, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He nodded slowly, as if understanding the twisted logic Hudson had just thrown out. Mr. Harrison then said in a flat tone that he had just learned Mrs. Ruby was using the car and that he appreciated Hudson's honesty. Hudson, who took his father-in-law's response as a sign of approval, or at least a sign of an old man's helplessness against a young one, smiled widely in triumph. He felt great because he had managed to control his wife's family assets without resistance. Behind the dining table covered in a silk cloth, Mr. Harrison's hand moved slowly to take his smartphone from his pocket. Without looking at the screen, his fingers, which had already memorized the messaging app's layout, typed a short command to his head of security and corporate operations team. He didn't need many words, just one command sentence to activate the asset repossession protocol. The message was sent in seconds, bringing with it a storm of destruction heading toward Hudson and his mother. Mr. Harrison then put his phone back, took his cup of coffee, and sipped it with enjoyment, as if he had just signed a very profitable business contract. His eyes looked at Claire softly, sending a silent signal that everything would be okay and that the father had taken control. Hudson resumed eating hungrily, completely unaware that above his head, the sword of Damocles was ready to fall and sever his arrogance. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, a contrasting scene was unfolding at an elite shopping mall that served as a gathering spot for the city's socialites. The cloudy sky didn't dampen Mrs. Ruby's intention to show off her new toy. In the grand main lobby drop-off area, a shiny black Cadillac Escalade was parked in a position intentionally made slightly diagonal so everyone could see it. Mrs. Ruby stood beside the car with her chin held high. She wore branded clothing from head to toe, with colors that clashed just to show off the logos. A fake crocodile skin handbag hung on her arm, and her fingers were filled with excessively shiny gold rings. Around Mrs. Ruby, 5 of her social circle friends stood with various gazes. Some looked with admiration, some with envy, and others smirked because they knew the actual background of Mrs. Ruby's family, which was quite ordinary. However, today the stage belonged to Mrs. Ruby. With an intentionally loud voice, she told the story of how this big and powerful car was a special gift from her beloved son, Hudson. She boasted that Hudson's business was skyrocketing, allowing him to buy her a car worth nearly $100,000 in cash, without credit. She tapped the car's hood as if patting her own son's shoulder, bragging about how comfortable the heated and cooled seats were, as well as the sophistication of the car's audio system. She didn't mention Claire's name at all, as if her daughter-in-law had no role in her son's success. Her friends gave fake compliments that made Mrs. Ruby's ego swell. They praised how devoted Hudson was and how lucky Mrs. Ruby was to have a successful son who knew how to honor his parents. Mrs. Ruby absorbed all the praise like a sponge soaking up water, feeling like she was on top of the world. She even took the time to mock one of her friends, who was only dropped off in an old sedan, saying it was time to change vehicles for safety and comfort. Satisfied with the showing-off session that lasted nearly half an hour, Mrs. Ruby finally decided to end the meeting. She said goodbye with a forced, elegant style, saying she had to go to a regular salon for a facial. Mrs. Ruby opened the car door by pressing a button on the handle, then stepped into the cool cabin that smelled of new leather. She sat in the driver's seat, adjusting her position to look tall, and waved one last time to her friends, still standing on the lobby sidewalk, watching her departure. With full confidence, Mrs. Ruby pressed the start-stop engine button. However, this is where the nightmare began. Instead of the sound of a smooth engine starting, the car emitted a long, ear-piercing beep. The instrument panel on the dashboard, which usually lit up with futuristic graphics, now turned completely red. All the indicator lights flashed simultaneously, like a broken disco light, creating a panic-filled atmosphere inside the cramped cabin. Before Mrs. Ruby could understand what was happening, an automated voice from the car's computer system sounded loudly through the premium speakers she had just bragged about. The voice was cold, flat and robotic, but the message was very clear. The system stated that a security alert had been activated because the asset was detected as being used by an unauthorized party. The voice repeatedly said the engine system had been permanently locked by the administrator. Mrs. Ruby panicked. She tried pressing the start button repeatedly, stepped on the brake pedal, and even hit the steering wheel with her palm. But the car remained completely dead, like a pile of expensive scrap metal. Her face began to turn pale, and cold sweat started to drip, ruining her thick makeup. The situation became even more embarrassing when the car's security system triggered the horn to beep rhythmically as a theft warning. The loud horn echoed throughout the high-ceiling mall lobby, drawing everyone's attention. Security guards, passing visitors, taxi drivers, and of course, Mrs. Ruby's social circle friends who hadn't left yet, all turned toward the Escalade. Mrs. Ruby's friends who were previously impressed now began whispering while holding back laughter, seeing Mrs. Ruby looking like a fish in an aquarium, panicking and banging on the windows from the inside. Mrs. Ruby tried to open the door to escape the shame, but the doors were automatically locked by the central lock system controlled remotely by Mr. Harrison's IT team. She was trapped inside the luxury car, becoming a free spectacle for hundreds of pairs of eyes. At the headquarters of Mr. Harrison's company, a young IT staff member stared at his monitor with a flat expression. He had just executed a priority order from the company owner. On his screen, the status of the car with that license plate was written as Locked, Unauthorized User. The staff member then typed the next command to unlock the doors after a 3-minute delay, enough to provide a psychological shock, while simultaneously sending the current location signal to the asset recovery team already on standby in the field. In the mall lobby, Mrs. Ruby felt those 3 minutes were like 3 years. She could see her friends starting to take out their phones, not to help, but to record the ridiculous incident. She screamed for help, but her voice was muffled by the soundproof windows. She cried hysterically, her mascara running into black liquid down her cheeks, destroying the grand image she had built so painstakingly. When the door lock finally opened automatically with a loud click, Mrs. Ruby didn't immediately get out. She was too weak and in shock. However, she had no other choice because, from a distance, a bright orange towing truck with a large company logo, her in-laws' company, had already entered the lobby area, parting the crowd. The officers who stepped down from the truck were not dusty common tow drivers, but 2 security officers in black uniforms who were well-built and stern-faced. They walked straight toward Mrs. Ruby's car with steady steps, carrying a folder containing legal asset seizure documents. It was then that Mrs. Ruby realized this wasn't just a simple engine failure. This was a counterattack, and she was on the front lines of a battlefield, with no weapon, other than her already shattered pride. The atmosphere in the lobby, which had been just busy with normal visitor activity, now turned into a gripping yet laughable performance arena. The arrival of the large orange tow truck with its silent rotating lights parted the crowd like Moses parting the sea. On the right and left sides of the truck, the name of the large company owned by Claire's father was clearly written, a name highly respected in the national business world. The two well-built security officers who stepped off the truck were well known in the business world. When the situation changed in the business world, things shifted quickly. The car doors were opened wide, letting the hot lobby air and the noisy crowd sounds rush into the once cool cabin. The security officer bowed slightly, but his tone contained no friendliness at all. He asked Mrs. Ruby to immediately exit the vehicle because the company asset was being secured. Mrs. Ruby, feeling her dignity trampled, felt her anger rise. She gripped the steering wheel as hard as she could, refusing to budge. With a shrill, cracking voice, she screamed that the car belonged to her son, Hudson, and no one had the right to take it. She threatened to report the officers to the police on charges of carjacking. Mrs. Ruby's hysterical screams echoed against the lobby ceiling, making mall visitors huddle closer to see who the middle-aged woman throwing a tantrum was. Several people began taking out their phones, activating cameras, and recording the embarrassing incident live. The security officer was not provoked. Calmly, he took out a plastic folder containing official documents. He showed the asset repossession warrant, which was fully signed and stamped. He explained in a loud voice that could be heard by those in the front of the crowd that the vehicle was registered as operational inventory for Harrison Global Corp. And was currently being misused by a party without written permission. The words company asset and misused buzzed in the ears of Mrs. Ruby's socialite friends still standing frozen on the sidewalk. Their faces changed from confusion to full of mockery. Whispers began to spread the news that the luxury car Mrs. Ruby had flaunted was merely a borrowed car from her in-laws, not the result of her own son's success. Because Mrs. Ruby continued to rebel and refused to get out, the security officers finally took firm action, according to procedure. One of the officers gave a signal to his partner. They both, with practiced efficiency that didn't cause harm, released Mrs. Ruby's grip on the steering wheel. Mrs. Ruby flailed like a child having a tantrum, her feet kicking the air. But the strength of a middle-aged woman who rarely exercised was no match for two trained guards. In seconds, Mrs. Ruby was successfully removed from the car. She stumbled and almost fell to the asphalt if she hadn't caught her balance by holding onto a lobby pillar. Her fake handbag fell, its contents spilling out. Cheap lipstick, crumpled tissues, and a thick wallet that turned out to only be full of grocery receipts. The next scene was the peak of all shame. The tow driver quickly attached hooks to the front bumper of the Escalade. The tow engine roared, pulling the large car onto the truck bed smoothly. Mrs. Ruby ran after it, hitting the side of the truck while wailing, begging for the car not to be taken away. She screamed Hudson's name, as if her son could suddenly appear and save her. However, no hero came. The truck slowly moved away, carrying the status symbol Mrs. Ruby had long bragged about. She was left alone in the middle of the driveway, her hair that had been piled high now a mess. her running mascara making her look like a ghost in broad daylight. No one around her helped. Instead, they were busy uploading videos of the incident to social media. One of Mrs. Ruby's social circle friends, the sharp-tongued woman she had mocked earlier about the old car, walked over with a cynical smile. She didn't offer a hand to help Mrs. Ruby up, but only spoke words that were quiet yet piercing, telling Mrs. Ruby to just order a ride share because it seemed her son's car was busy with business matters. Those words were met with small laughs from the other friends. Mrs. Ruby looked around dazed. Her world, built on lies, collapsed instantly. A notification on one of the visitors' phones chirped. The video of Mrs. Ruby being dragged by security had already entered the city's gossip account with thousands of viewers within minutes. The title was painful: Elite-style mother-in-law. Car turned out to be repossessed by in-laws. Back at the Harrison residence, the party was still going on quietly, in stark contrast to the chaos that had just occurred in the mall lobby. Soft piano music played, accompanying guests as they enjoyed dessert. Claire sat quietly in her chair, her eyes fixed on the empty plate in front of her, trying to ignore the sound of her husband chewing as he still ate hungrily beside her. Hudson looked so relaxed, occasionally letting out a small burp without covering his mouth, feeling like a little king in his father-in-law's house after successfully answering Mr. Harrison's question without being challenged. He didn't know that the quiet in the room was the calm before a massive storm hit. Suddenly, Hudson's phone lying on the table vibrated violently, accompanied by a loud ringtone set to maximum volume. The sound broke the room's tranquility, making several of Claire's uncles turn with annoyed looks. Hudson quickly grabbed his phone, seeing Mother on the screen. He smiled widely, thinking his mother was calling to thank him for being able to show off the new car. With confidence, Hudson answered the call without moving from the dining table, letting everyone hear his conversation. However, the smile on Hudson's face vanished in an instant. The voice coming from the other end wasn't a thank you, but a hysterical scream mixed with bitter crying. Mrs. Ruby's voice was so loud it could be heard faintly by Claire sitting next to him. Hudson's face changed drastically, from flush with embarrassment to pale with anger. He listened to his mother's fragmented report, saying her car was forcibly taken by bad people, that she was humiliated in front of her friends, and that she was now stranded on the side of the road. Hudson's narrow mind immediately concluded that this was Claire's doing. He thought Claire must have reported it to the police or canceled the car's insurance out of spite. His anger peaked. Hudson slammed his spoon onto the plate, making a loud clinking sound that silenced the entire room. He stood up suddenly, his chair screeching loudly against the marble floor. With bulging eyes, Hudson pointed at Claire's face while she remained seated calmly. He yelled at his wife in front of dozens of relatives present, accusing Claire of being an unfaithful wife who dared to embarrass her own mother-in-law. Hudson screamed, asking what Claire had done to make the car get taken away. The veins in Hudson's neck bulged out, his face fierce, ready to unleash a barrage of insults. Claire looked up, staring at her husband with a gaze that was hard to interpret, a mixture of pity and exhaustion. However, before Claire could open her mouth to defend herself, a baritone voice interrupted. cutting through Hudson's anger like a hot knife through butter. Mr. Harrison stood up from his main chair. His movements were slow and unhurried, but they carried an aura that made everyone hold their breath. He didn't scream, didn't hit the table. He just raised one hand slightly, signaling for Hudson to be quiet. Miraculously, the fired-up Hudson went silent, his mouth still slightly open. Mr. Harrison walked around the table, his step steady as he approached his son-in-law. He stopped exactly 2 steps in front of Hudson, staring into the young man's eyes with a sharp, piercing gaze. The gaze of a businessman who had faced many rivals. Mr. Harrison said in a flat tone that there was nothing wrong with the car. He explained that the car was taken because the original owner, the company, decided its current user was unfit. Hudson gasped, trying to process his father-in-law's words. Mr. Harrison continued, this time with a colder tone. He said he heard Hudson's mother needed a vehicle, so he suggested Hudson immediately go join his mother who was overheating on the side of the road. Hudson stammered, trying to defend himself by saying he had to get back to the office, but Mr. Harrison cut him off again. With a deadly calm, Mr. Harrison told Hudson a new fact. He asked for the keys to the sedan Hudson had driven there, the company car Hudson had been using for work. Hudson reflexively gripped his pocket, reluctant to hand over the keys. Mr. Harrison gave a thin, terrifying smile. He said that the car was a facility for employees. And as of 5 o'clock this afternoon, Hudson's name had been removed from the company's payroll due to serious ethical violations and misuse of assets. So Hudson was no longer entitled to the car. The news of the firing was delivered just like that, in the middle of a family dinner, as if Mr. Harrison were talking about the weather. The blood seemed to drain from Hudson's face. His legs felt weak. He was fired, in front of his wife's entire family. He tried to look for support, turning toward Claire's uncles and aunts, but they all looked at him with disgust and coldness. Not a single person sympathized. Mr. Harrison held out his hand, demanding the keys. With a trembling hand, Hudson reached into his pocket and handed over the sedan keys. It felt like handing over his own life. Without that car and without that job, he was nothing. However, the humiliation wasn't over. Mr. Harrison reached into his own pocket, taking out $100 bill. He folded the bill neatly and tucked it into the pocket of Hudson's expensive silk shirt. Mr. Harrison patted the pocket gently, then whispered loud enough for those around them to hear. He said the money was for a taxi or an Uber because premium rides were too expensive, and Hudson should start learning to save as he had earlier suggested for Claire. Mr. Harrison then gave a signal to the house security chief, already standing ready in the corner of the room. 2 well-built house guards approached. They didn't touch Hudson roughly, but just stood flanking him, providing strong psychological pressure for Hudson to leave immediately. Hudson looked at Claire one last time, hoping his wife would defend him. But Claire had already turned away, busy pouring warm tea for her mother, as if Hudson were no longer there. With a heavy gait and a dignity shattered into pieces, Hudson was escorted out of the grand dining room, past the leftovers of the delicious food he hadn't finished, toward the exit. Behind him, family chatter slowly resumed, as if a piece of trash blocking the view had just been thrown away. Hudson stepped out of the main door of the Harrison estate with a mix of exploding anger and bone-crushing shame. The 2 well-built guards who had escorted him continued to shadow him until he reached the towering iron gates. They said nothing, but their eyes spoke volumes that Hudson was now just garbage to be immediately cleared from the luxury property area. When the automatic gate closed slowly behind his back with a heavy metallic thud, Hudson felt as if the door to his comfortable life had just been locked forever. He stood frozen on the sidewalk outside the fence, looking back at the grand house whose lights shone warmly. The place where he should have been enjoying the rest of the afternoon as a favored son-in-law, not as an outcast who was fired and evicted. The sky that had been cloudy finally poured its contents. The rain came down, not just as a drizzle, but as a heavy and cold downpour, as if nature itself were joining the feast of humiliation against Hudson today. Hudson hurried to take cover under a roadside tree whose leaves weren't thick enough to withstand the onslaught of water. His expensive silk shirt, which he had bought with Claire's credit card, began to get wet and stick to his skin. He reached into his pocket frantically, taking out his smartphone whose screen was slightly wet from raindrops. With trembling fingers, he opened a ride-sharing app. He had to leave this place quickly before any neighbors or his father-in-law's acquaintances saw him standing miserably on the side of the road like a beggar in a suit. However, a new problem arose. The elite residential complex where the Harrisons lived had very strict security rules. The app on Hudson's phone showed a notification that drivers were not allowed to enter the private cluster area for pickups unless there was access permission from the homeowner. Hudson tried to call the security post at the front, hoping they would open the gate for his ride, but his call was rejected. His number had clearly been blocked or marked to be ignored. There was no other choice. Hudson had to walk to the main gate of the residential complex, which was nearly 2 miles from where he stood now. The distance he usually traveled in minutes in a climate-controlled car now stretched before him as a path of torture. Hudson began to walk with heavy steps, his polished leather shoes stepping into dirty puddles on the asphalt. Every step was painful to his pride. The rain grew heavier, accompanied by strong winds that made the trees sway violently. In less than 5 minutes, Hudson was completely soaked. His hair, which had been neatly styled with pomade, was now flat against his forehead, and rainwater flowed heavily down his face, masking the tears of anger that began to fall. He cursed Claire in his heart. He cursed Mr. Harrison, feeling he was treated unfairly. According to his twisted logic, as a son-in-law, he had the right to enjoy those facilities, and his father-in-law's anger was considered excessive over a mere car issue. He didn't realize that the main problem was his years of accumulated lack of self-awareness. As Hudson was walking unsteadily through the storm, a very bright set of car headlights illuminated his back from behind. Hudson stepped to the edge of the sidewalk, hoping it was just a neighbor passing by. However, the car slowed down as it approached him. It was a large white SUV, the exact same model as the one taken from his mother that afternoon. But this was a brand new unit with temporary plates. Hudson turned, hoping for a little mercy. Perhaps Mr. Harrison had changed his mind and ordered the driver to take him to the front. The car windows were clear, having been treated with the best water-repellent coating. Thus, Hudson could see clearly who was inside. In the driver's seat sat Mr. Harrison. The middle-aged man drove calmly. One hand held the steering wheel. his face calm and dry, enjoying the classical music faintly heard from outside. Beside him sat Claire. His wife had changed into warmer clothes. Claire was holding a tumbler of a hot drink, her face looking peaceful. As the car passed slowly right beside Hudson, time seemed to move in slow motion. Hudson stared intensely at his wife's face, hoping Claire would turn, see her freezing husband, and ask her father to stop. However, that hope was crushed. Claire stared straight ahead. Her gaze was blank, as if Hudson were just a light pole or a trash can on the side of the road, not worthy of attention. There was no hatred in Claire's eyes. There was only absolute indifference. The car then sped up again, running through a deep puddle and splashing thick brown mud right onto Hudson's soaked trousers. Hudson stood frozen, covered in mud and rainwater, watching the taillights of the luxury car disappear around the corner toward the exit gate, leaving him alone in the bone-chilling cold. An hour later, Hudson finally arrived at his rental house, the house he had always called his personal home, even though the rent and installments were paid in full by Claire. His body shook violently, his lips blue from the cold. He entered the house, slamming the door, hoping to find a bit of warmth, or at least a place to vent his emotions. However, the sight that greeted him in the living room only made his head ache more. The house was a mess. On the living room sofa, Mrs. Ruby sat curled up, her hair disheveled, and the remnants of running mascara still visible on her cheeks. His mother was also soaked. It seemed she too had struggled to get a ride from the mall and had to fight her own way home. Seeing Hudson return in the same miserable state, Mrs. Ruby didn't ask how he was or get him a towel. Instead, she immediately stood up and exploded in anger. She pointed at Hudson's face, screaming and asking where his responsibility as a son was. Mrs. Ruby retold the tragedy at the mall with a dramatized version, saying she was treated like a criminal and laughed at by the whole city. She blamed Hudson for not knowing how to manage his wife, accusing Hudson of being too soft on Claire, which led to his daughter-in-law having the nerve to act disrespectfully by repossessing the car. Mrs. Ruby's shrill screams filled the small house, making Hudson's ears ring. Hudson, who was already physically and mentally exhausted, couldn't take it anymore. For the first time in his life, he shouted back at his mother. He threw his work bag to the floor and yelled that all of this happened because of his mother's greed and need to show off. He said he was fired, evicted, and humiliated in front of the Harrison family because of his mother's big mouth about the car's ownership. Mrs. Ruby went silent for a moment hearing the word fired, her eyes widening. However, that woman's ego was too high to admit fault. She instead flipped the facts, saying that if Hudson were truly successful and wealthy as he always bragged, the firing wouldn't be a problem. The argument between mother and son was fierce, throwing blame at each other, exposing each other's secrets they had long covered up with the guise of a harmonious and wealthy family. The debate only stopped when their stomachs growled loudly in unison. Hunger took over their emotions. They realized that since noon, not a single piece of food had entered their stomachs. The luxury food at the Harrison party was now just a memory, and Mrs. Ruby hadn't had a chance to eat lunch at the mall because she was busy showing off. The exhaustion from stress and being out in the rain made the hunger feel painful. Hudson let out a long breath, trying to lower his ego. He sat on the sofa that was wet from his clothes, then took out his phone again. He intended to order a lot of expensive fast food to relieve their stress. He thought that at least good food could slightly heal this bad day. Hudson opened a food delivery app. His fingers quickly chose a family meal deal from his favorite fried chicken restaurant, plus several side dishes and large drinks. The total bill reached nearly $50. Without hesitation, he pressed the order button, choosing the credit card payment method already saved in the app. The loading circle spun on his phone screen. Hudson waited while swallowing hard, imagining the hot, crispy fried chicken. However, instead of an order confirmation, a red error message appeared on the screen. Transaction failed. Payment declined by issuing bank. Hudson frowned, thinking there might be a network glitch. He tried again, this time using a second credit card. The platinum card he had always bragged about to his friends. The result was the same. Declined. Cold sweat began to appear on his temples, mixing with the rainwater that hadn't dried. He tried a debit card, a shopping card, every card registered in his digital wallet. One by one, they all declined the transaction. That was when reality hit him hard. He just remembered that all those cards were supplementary cards whose primary account was Claire's salary account. All this time, Claire was the one funding their lifestyle, and Hudson was just riding along. Hudson's fingers trembled violently. He opened his mobile banking app to check his personal account balance, his salary account from his job at Mr. Harrison's company. The number on the screen made him weak. $10. That was all the money left from his own work. The rest had been spent on his mother's electronics installments last month. That account, too, would likely be frozen soon since he had been fired. Hudson looked at Mrs. Ruby with a pale face. He said haltingly that none of the cards could be used. Claire had blocked them all. Mrs. Ruby shrieked in frustration, throwing a sofa pillow at Hudson, lamenting her fate of having to starve in her own home. As if the suffering weren't complete, suddenly a loud and constant beep-beep sound came from the electric meter outside the house. It was the warning for a critical electricity balance. Hudson and Mrs. Ruby looked at each other in fear. All this time, the electricity had always been automatically topped up by Mr. Harrison's household assistants, who managed the children's logistics. Now, that facility was gone. The warning sound felt like a countdown for a time bomb. Hudson reached into his pocket, looking for the cash given by Mr. Harrison earlier. The $100 bill was soaked and crumpled. Before he could think about running to buy electricity credit at the nearby convenience store, a loud click sound was heard. Instantly, all the lights in the house went out. The fans stopped spinning. The television died. Total darkness enveloped them. The rental house became pitch black, illuminated only by occasional flashes of lightning from outside the window. In that darkness, Mrs. Ruby's sobbing began to turn into whimpering like a frightened child. Hudson sat leaning against the sofa in the dark, his stomach aching from hunger, his body shivering from the cold, and his wallet empty. Tonight, for the first time in his pampered life, Hudson felt what true poverty was. There was no food, no light, and no way out. That morning, the sun rose with a stinging heat, contrasting with the gloomy atmosphere inside Hudson's rental house, which was still dark without electricity. Hudson woke up with his body sticky with sweat, because the fans and air conditioning had been completely dead all night. He opened his eyes with a throbbing headache. The remnants of last night's stress and hunger still haunted his body. There was no breakfast on the dining table, no aroma of coffee usually brewed by a maid, and worst of all, no clean water flowing in the bathroom because the water pump also depended on the electricity that had been cut. Out of necessity, Hudson bathed, using the remaining water in the tub, which was already murky, then put back on his work shirt, which had been soaked the day before. The shirt was now dry but wrinkled, smelling musty, and the mud stains on his trousers were still visible, even after being scrubbed with a wet cloth. He looked at a cracked mirror in the corner of the room, seeing his disheveled reflection, a dull face, red eyes from lack of sleep, and an untidy beard starting to grow. However, his massive ego still forced him to go to the office. In his mind, that still denied reality. He thought that yesterday's firing was just Mr. Harrison's emotional threat. He was sure that if he went and apologized, or at least showed dedication to his work, his father-in-law would soften. The commute, which he usually made comfortably in a cooled sedan, now became its own torture. Hudson had to walk to the main road, then squeeze into a crowded city bus, filled with the smell of sweat from thousands of other passengers. He stood squeezed near the door, making sure his leather shoes weren't stepped on while holding back nausea from an empty stomach. Upon arriving at the central business district, Hudson walked toward Mr. Harrison's skyscraper with steps he tried to make steady. He straightened his collar, trying to regain the dignity he had lost. However, the gazes of several former colleagues he passed on the sidewalk felt different. They didn't greet him. Instead, they turned away or whispered while glancing cynically. Apparently, the news of the party incident and the viral video of his mother had spread faster than his footsteps. Hudson entered the grand lobby with its shiny marble floors. He walked toward the automatic entry gate, taking out his employee ID card hanging around his neck. With a movement that had been muscle memory for the past 3 years, he tapped the card against the scanner. Usually, the light would turn green and the gate would open. But this time, the machine emitted a loud, long buzz, and the indicator light turned bright red. The text, "Access denied," was clearly displayed on the machine's small screen. Hudson tried tapping it again, once, twice, 3 times, as panic began to crawl up his throat. The line of employees behind him began to grow annoyed. The sound of rejection felt like a siren announcing his status as an outcast. Before Hudson could hit the machine out of frustration, 2 large building security guards were already standing in front of him. One of them was the security chief, whom Hudson used to boss around, telling him to buy cigarettes or carry his mother's shopping bags. But today, the guard's gaze was cold and distant, as if looking at a suspicious stranger. The guard did not salute. In a flat and firm voice, he told Hudson he was forbidden from entering the office area. The order came directly from the board of directors, and Hudson's name was already on the building's security blacklist. Hudson tried to argue, shouting that he wanted to meet the HR director to clear up the misunderstanding, but the guard only shook his head firmly. The guard then leaned down to pick up a cardboard box that had been placed under the reception desk. He shoved the box toward Hudson roughly. Inside the box lay Hudson's personal belongings that had been cleared from his desk. A framed photo of himself and Claire with cracked glass. A coffee mug that said "The Boss," a stapler, and several cheap pens. On top of the pile of junk lay a sealed white envelope with the company's official letterhead. It was the termination notice. Hudson opened the envelope with trembling hands. His eyes swept over line after line of cold, yet deadly legal sentences. The reason for the firing was written in bold. Serious violation of the Code of Ethics, misuse of company assets, and behavior tarnishing the corporate image. There was no severance pay, no letter of recommendation. There was only a notice that he must return all inventory or face criminal charges. Hudson stood frozen in the middle of the busy lobby, clutching the cardboard box like a lost person. He felt naked in front of hundreds of people passing by. The shame burned his face up to his ears. He turned and walked weakly out of the building, away from the place that used to give him identity and pride. He sat on a park bench not far from there, taking out his phone. He didn't want to give up. He was sure that with his 3 years of experience at a large company, he could easily get a job elsewhere, maybe even at Mr. Harrison's competitors. With the last of his dwindling data, he began to call several acquaintances at rival firms. The first call connected to a marketing manager at another property company who had once tried to headhunt him. Hudson tried to sound cheerful, greeting him familiarly and making small talk before stating he was looking for a new challenge. However, the tone of the person on the other end sounded awkward and rushed. The man cut Hudson's conversation short and said bluntly that he had heard what happened. He explained that this business industry is very small, and news of asset misuse is poison to anyone's reputation. No reputable company would dare hire someone fired directly by Mr. Harrison with a poor integrity record. The man apologized and quickly hung up. Hudson tried calling the second contact, the third, up to the 10th. The result was the same. Some didn't pick up, some blocked his number immediately, and some openly said that Hudson's name was already on the industry's HR blacklist. Mr. Harrison had truly closed all doors. Hudson hadn't just lost a job. He had lost his future. Under the harsh sun, Hudson realized he was now an unemployed man with a trash reputation that couldn't be sold anywhere. A week passed since the eviction incident, and Hudson's life sank deeper into difficulty. He and his mother survived in the dark rental house by selling their remaining electronics one by one. From the television to the blender, to a passing junk dealer at a very low price. The money from those sales was only enough for 1 meal a day and to buy candles for light. In the midst of that desperation, a court courier arrived to deliver a summons. Claire had officially filed for divorce. Hudson read the divorce petition with eyes filled with a devious glint. His manipulative brain saw this not as an end, but as a golden opportunity. He thought about marital assets. During 3 years of marriage, Claire's wealth and Mr. Harrison's gifts were vast. According to Hudson's logic, he was entitled to half of that wealth because he was the legal husband. Mrs. Ruby, who was chewing cold rice in the corner of the room, immediately became excited when she heard about the asset lawsuit. She whispered poison into her son's ear, telling Hudson to demand a share of the luxury house they used to live in, the cars, and the company shares. Mrs. Ruby convinced Hudson that the law would surely side with the husband and that Claire wouldn't have the heart to let her ex-husband be destitute. With his last bit of money, Hudson hired a cheap lawyer operating out of a suburban storefront, a lawyer who boasted more than he won cases. But Hudson had no other choice. He came to court with a false confidence that he would walk out as a new millionaire. The day of the hearing arrived. The atmosphere at the family court felt stiff and cold. Hudson came wearing his best remaining shirt, though it looked a bit loose because he had lost weight drastically in the last week. He sat in the defendant's chair with a face made to look as poor as possible to gain the judge's sympathy, but his eyes radiated greed. On the other side of the room, the door opened and Claire entered. The woman's appearance was truly different. She looked glowing, wearing an elegant sea blue dress and a neatly draped scarf. Her face was clean, calm, and radiated a firmness Hudson had never seen before. Claire didn't come alone. She sat accompanied by the best family law team in the country. Men in expensive suits, carrying leather briefcases full of documents. The trial began with the reading of the petition and the response. When it came time to discuss marital assets, Hudson's lawyer immediately attacked with unreasonable demands. He asked for a distribution of assets worth millions of dollars, claiming Hudson had played a role in managing the family business and maintaining household stability. Hudson even dared to add crocodile tears, saying he had been evicted inhumanely without being allowed to take any property. He demanded material and immaterial compensation. Mrs. Ruby sat in the visitor's chair nodding in agreement, her eyes gleaming at the thought of the money they would receive. However, the smiles of triumph on Hudson's and his mother's faces didn't last long. Claire's lead lawyer, a middle-aged man with thick glasses and a sharp gaze, stood up calmly. He didn't refute Hudson's claims with emotional words, but with data. He asked the judge's permission to present evidence of a forensic financial audit of the household during the 3 years of marriage. The lawyer opened a large box containing stacks of bank statements, credit card bills, and thick stacks of transfer receipts. He began to present shocking facts. It turned out that during the marriage, Hudson had never given a single cent of financial support to Claire. Hudson's meager salary was always spent on his personal needs and Mrs. Ruby's lifestyle. Even worse, Claire's lawyer showed evidence that all the luxury facilities enjoyed by Hudson and his mother, overseas vacations, Mrs. Ruby's designer bags, jewelry, even the costs of renovating his mother's house in the country, were all paid for using supplementary credit cards in Claire's name. Legally, the use of those funds without written permission and outside of household decisions was improper. He requested that Hudson return all that money, or the assets bought with it would be seized as compensation. The judge's gavel struck with a booming sound that felt like a death sentence for Hudson's future. The panel of judges, after weighing the undeniable evidence, decided to grant Claire's divorce and reject all of Hudson's asset claims. Furthermore, the judge ruled that Hudson was proven to have an obligation to return the funds used illegally. As a guarantee, the judge ordered the seizure of assets in the name of the defendant or his family, proven to be bought with those funds. This meant the only house Mrs. Ruby owned in the countryside, whose title had just been redeemed using Claire's credit card money, would be seized by the state to be auctioned. Hearing the verdict, Mrs. Ruby shrieked hysterically in the courtroom, her body convulsing, her eyes wide with disbelief that her greed had become a boomerang that destroyed the little wealth she had left. She fainted on the courtroom floor, creating a commotion. Hudson sat frozen in his chair, his body weak as if his bones had been removed. He looked at Claire, hoping for some mercy in the eyes of the woman who once loved him. But Claire had already stood up, tidying her scarf, and walked out of the courtroom without looking back. Behind her, medical staff entered to carry Mrs. Ruby away, while Hudson realized he had come in wanting to be rich, but was leaving as a vagrant with debts worth millions of dollars. Hudson and Mrs. Ruby's lives changed 180 degrees after the judge's gavel hit. The execution of the asset seizure happened much faster and more cruelly than they ever imagined. Mrs. Ruby's only house in her hometown, which she had always bragged about as a symbol of her son's success, was now fitted with a bright red sign stating it was seized by the state. There was no longer a place to go home to, no more assets to pawn, and no more money in the bank to even rent a decent place. They were forcibly evicted from their previous rental for being 2 months behind on payments, and now they were stranded in a slum rental in a very densely populated outskirts of the city. Their new home was at the end of a muddy, narrow alley, where sunlight struggled to penetrate, blocked by the eaves of crowded houses. The rental walls were made of rough, unplastered concrete blocks. The asbestos roof leaked here and there, creating water stains on the ceiling, and the air inside felt stifled, mixed with the smell of a stagnant ditch right in front of the rotting wooden door. Inside that cramped space, luxury was a dead word. There were no more soft spring mattresses for their backs, no air conditioning to cool their skin, only a single thin mat serving as a bed on the cold concrete floor. Every night, they had to sleep accompanied by hungry mosquitoes and the noise of rats running across the ceiling. Mrs. Ruby, the woman who once always appeared stunning with millions of dollars in skincare and branded clothes, now looked like a completely different person. Her face was dull and oily, fine wrinkles appearing deep due to the toll of stress and a lack of good nutrition. Her hair, once always styled at an expensive salon, was now often flat, musty, and tied up haphazardly with a used rubber band from a takeout meal. There were no more socialite friends to praise her. There were only neighbors who watched with suspicion. Every day, Mrs. Ruby had to wake up before the dawn prayer call, not to go for a morning walk or prepare for a gathering as was her old habit, but to start work as a laundry and ironing laborer for her neighbors, most of whom were factory workers. To survive so as not to starve, this former fake socialite was forced to humble herself to perform the menial labor she once looked down upon. Her soft hands, which once only held porcelain teacups, were now rough, calloused, and cracked from cheap detergent that burned her skin. Often, she cried alone in the communal bathroom while scrubbing stains from other people's clothes, lamenting her fate of becoming a servant to people whose economic status she used to consider beneath her. However, none of the neighbors sympathized with her. They often mocked and scolded Mrs. Ruby because her work was slow, not clean enough, and she still liked to complain about the quality of the laundry soap. Hudson's condition was no less miserable. It could even be said he experienced a mental collapse worse than his mother's. The college degree from a prestigious university he once bragged about every time he applied for work was now worth no more than grease-stained paper. The black mark of being a dishonest employee, an asset embezzler, and a person fired dishonorably by Mr. Harrison's large company made him flatly rejected by every firm. Even small companies needing administrative staff were reluctant to hire someone with an integrity record as poor as Hudson's. The corporate world had slammed its doors shut for him. Finally, to get a bite of food, Hudson was forced to throw away the sky-high pride he once had. He worked odd jobs at the city's central market as a daily porter. Every night until dawn, Hudson had to carry 100-pound sacks of rice, vegetables, and onions from cargo trucks to vendors' stalls. His back, which used to lean comfortably in a clean office chair, was now chafed, bruised, and hunched from the heavy load, punishing his spine. His skin, once clean and cared for due to regular treatments, was now sun-scorched, oily, and covered in grime that was hard to wash off even with soap. His feet, once always encased in shiny leather shoes, were now only clad in thin flip-flops held together by a safety pin, stepping through the market's rot-filled mud. Hudson often had to fight for loads with other porters who were stronger, and he was not infrequently shoved into the mud. He became a laughingstock for the market people who didn't know he was once an arrogant young manager. Every time Hudson returned to the cramped rental and was exhausted, the atmosphere at home didn't give him peace to rest. Instead, it greeted him with new pain. The arguments between mother and son became unavoidable daily bread. Mrs. Ruby, who couldn't accept a hard life, constantly blamed Hudson for all this suffering. With a shrill voice, she cursed Hudson as a useless son who was stupid for not knowing how to keep a wealthy and devoted wife like Claire. She kept bringing up the past, saying that if Hudson had been smarter about winning Mr. Harrison's heart and not too honest about the car, they wouldn't have ended up in a place like this. Hudson, who was already physically and mentally drained, no longer accepted the insults as he had when he was a submissive son. His respect for his mother had been eroded by the bitter reality. He countered his mother's insults with words that were far more cruel and painful. He screamed in his mother's face that all of this was karma for her arrogant mouth and a lifestyle that wanted to look rich with a stolen Escalade. Hudson blamed his mother's greed for forcing him to commit small acts of corruption and to lie, which ultimately cost him his job, his wife, and his future. Their hate-filled screams often ended with the breaking of plastic plates or the slamming of a door, making the neighbors through the thin walls bang on the wall and threaten to evict them if they continued to cause a commotion in the middle of the night. In that hot and stifling little petak, the bond between mother and son had evaporated without a trace, replaced by mutual hatred, blame, and a deep regret that was too late to fix. They were trapped together in the pit of poverty they had dug themselves, with no hope of ever climbing back out. 1 year had passed since the storm of destruction hit Hudson and his mother, erasing every trace of luxury they once enjoyed. Time continued to move without caring for their downtrodden fate. Meanwhile, for those who were patient and honest, time brought sweet rewards. That afternoon, in a fine dining restaurant located in the most elite business district in the city, the atmosphere was so cool, quiet, and elegant. The restaurant was known as a gathering spot for successful business people and the upper class. The marble floors gleamed, reflecting the crystal chandelier lights. The aroma of premium grilled steak and expensive coffee filled the air, perfectly temperature controlled by the central cooling system. Instrumental music played faintly, adding to the place's exclusive feel. At one of the best tables located right next to a large glass wall overlooking the main road, sat Claire and her father, Mr. Harrison. Claire's appearance was now much more stunning and authoritative compared to a year ago. She wore modern, modest attire, designed by a famous designer, that draped elegantly on her body, matching the soft patterned silk scarf she wore. Her face glowed naturally, radiating an inner peace and happiness that couldn't be faked. There were no more lines of sadness, mental pressure, or swollen eyes like when she was Hudson's oppressed wife. Claire was now a whole, independent, and respected woman. Today was a special day of celebration. Claire had just inaugurated the opening of the 5th branch of her modest fashion boutique, which had now become a trend among young women. The business she restarted with her own capital and her father's strategy had developed very rapidly in a short time, proving to the world, and especially to herself, that she was able to stand tall on her own feet without her father's shadow. Mr. Harrison looked at his daughter with a gaze full of pride and overflowing love. The old man looked healthy and vigorous. His smile was wide and free as he listened to Claire talk enthusiastically about her business expansion plans to penetrate the export market in neighboring countries. They enjoyed a dessert of sweet chocolate cake together, celebrating a true life victory. For Mr. Harrison, seeing his daughter free from the parasite that harmed her and growing into a resilient woman was a happiness whose price was invaluable. It was far more expensive than any type of luxury car he had ever bought. In the midst of the warm conversation and laughter, Claire's gaze unintentionally drifted toward the giant glass window beside her. The glass was thick and soundproof, functioning perfectly to separate two worlds that were poles apart. The world inside the restaurant that was quiet, fragrant, and luxurious, and the outside world that was noisy, hot, dusty, and cruel. On the sidewalk of the main road in front of the restaurant, heavy traffic was occurring because of the lunch hour. Claire saw a small commotion in the unofficial parking area not far from the restaurant's lobby entrance. An unofficial parking attendant in a faded, torn orange vest covered in oil was being yelled at by a luxury car owner because he was considered negligent for letting the car get scratched by a passing motorcycle. The parking attendant bowed low, begging for mercy with a very pathetic and fearful body gesture. He repeatedly pressed his hands together in front of his chest, apologizing so he wouldn't be hit or reported. The attendant's skin was sun-scorched black, his hair long and unkempt, and his body thin, as if chronically malnourished. His cheekbones were sharp, his eyes sunken and surrounded by dark circles. Claire's eyes narrowed, trying to recognize the familiar figure behind that beggar-like appearance. A moment later, Claire was stunned. It was Hudson, her ex-husband who once always appeared sharp in slick shirts, neat suits, and expensive watches, was now standing on the hot asphalt without proper shoes, receiving insults and being spat on for $2. Claire's heart stirred. However, it wasn't because of any remaining love or a surge of longing, but a strange sense of pity, like seeing a stranger suffering. Claire's eyes then moved slightly toward the sidewalk across from where Hudson stood. There sat a woman in worn-out clothes and a faded duster dress. The woman was selling small packets of tissues and masks to passing pedestrians with a pleading face. The woman's face was covered in road dust and sweat, the wrinkles deeper, but Claire could still clearly recognize Mrs. Ruby's features. The woman who once proudly flaunted fake bags at the mall, who insulted Claire for being childless and stupid at every social gathering, was now having to hold out her hand on the side of the road, hoping for the mercy of passers-by to buy a packet of tissues for 50 cents. The scene was so contrasting to Claire's last memory of them, as if there were an invisible bond or perhaps destiny wanting to show the end of a drama. Hudson, who had just finished being yelled at by the car owner, turned toward the luxury restaurant building. Perhaps he wanted to take cover for a moment from the scorching sun, or just see the comfortable life he could no longer feel. His eyes pierced through the clear glass window and met Claire's eyes as she was watching him. Time seemed to stop for Hudson. He was frozen in place, his feet seemingly nailed to the hot asphalt. Hudson saw his ex-wife sitting in there, so beautiful, clean, glowing, and happy. He saw Claire surrounded by the luxury he once felt and had wasted. He saw the delicious food on Claire's table, whose value was perhaps equal to his income from carrying sacks and parking cars for 3 full months. Shame, profound regret, and the destruction of his dignity hit Hudson so hard he felt breathless and wanted to vomit. He clearly saw what he had lost due to his ego and his mother's irrational greed. He wanted to scream, to call Claire's name, to run in and kneel to apologize so he could return to the past. But he realized that thick glass was a wall of fate that he could no longer penetrate. He was just dust out there, while Claire was a diamond in a display case. Hudson saw Mrs. Ruby also turn, and the old woman covered her mouth in shock, tears of regret flowing down her dirty, wrinkled cheeks. Claire stared into Hudson's watery eyes for a few seconds that felt long. There was no anger on Claire's face, no satisfied smile, and no burning grudge. There was only a flat and calm gaze. The gaze of someone looking at a finished past that no longer had any place in her life. Claire slowly looked away, breaking eye contact unilaterally. She went back to looking at her father, Mr. Harrison, who also noticed Hudson's presence outside, but chose not to care. Mr. Harrison just nodded slightly to his daughter with a smile, giving a silent signal that everything was in the past. Claire returned her father's smile softly. Then with an elegant and firm hand movement, she called the waiter. When the waiter arrived, Claire asked to close the window blinds because the sunlight was too bright. The waiter bowed respectfully and slowly pulled the blind cord. The thick gold-colored fabric descended inch by inch, slowly covering the view of the street, cutting off Hudson's view of Claire, separating the bright light inside the restaurant from the scorching heat outside. The blinds were closed tight, and for Claire, the book of her past was closed forever. Meanwhile, for Hudson and his mother, living in regret was a prison sentence without iron bars that they had to endure for the rest of their lives. 5 years is not a short time for the wheel of fate to turn completely. At a simple coffee stall with wooden plank walls on the edge of the Central Market, Hudson sat brooding with a blank stare. His appearance was now much older than his actual age. His once thick black hair was now graying and thinning in several parts, the skin of his face rough from sun exposure, and his teeth yellow from smoking too much to escape stress. He wore a faded campaign t-shirt and grimy shorts. In front of him sat a glass of thin black coffee and a piece of cold fried food, the only breakfast he could afford today, before returning to work carrying vegetables. The noise of the market and the screams of vendors seemed to be the background music of his bleak life. Hudson's attention was diverted when the stall owner turned up the volume on an old dusty television perched on a shelf. The morning news was airing a special profile on an inspiring female entrepreneur who had successfully penetrated the global market. Hudson's heart seemed to stop beating when he saw the face that appeared on the screen. It was Claire. However, the Claire he saw on television was very different from the Claire he used to know. The woman looked so elegant, authoritative, and radiated real happiness. Claire was being interviewed in the garden of a luxury house much larger than Mr. Harrison's old house, surrounded by beautiful flower beds. The camera then panned to a figure next to Claire. A man with a kind smile and a gentle gaze was holding a cute little boy. The man was Claire's new husband, a famous architect known for being religious and very loving toward his family. In the interview, Claire spoke with sparkling eyes, saying her success was inseparable from the support of her current husband, who always treated her like a queen and never demanded anything other than their mutual happiness. Claire also mentioned that she had just established a social foundation to help women victims of domestic neglect, a dedication from her dark past. There was no mention of Hudson's name in that success. For Claire, Hudson had been completely erased from history, no more than a small pebble that once made her stumble before she could finally run fast. Hudson felt an overwhelming tightness in his chest, as if a large stone were pressing against his lungs. He saw how perfect Claire's life was now. He saw the sincere love in the eyes of her new husband, something he had wasted because he was too busy chasing his mother's prestige. The regret came like a massive wave crashing against the rocks. But this time, the wave drowned him. Hudson remembered Mrs. Ruby, who was now bedridden in their cramped rental due to a mild stroke a year ago. His once arrogant mother could now only cry and mutter in her sleep, spending her old age in adult diapers that were rarely changed due to lack of money, with no socialite friends visiting. Hudson placed a few spare coins on the stall table with trembling hands, then walked away, leaving the television broadcast that still showed the happy laughter of Claire's small family. He walked out into the busy, muddy market, hoisting the heavy sack of onions back onto his shoulder. Rain began to drizzle, masking the tears that finally fell down Hudson's cheeks. He realized that the heaviest punishment was not poverty, but the awareness that he once had a diamond in his grasp and threw it away for a common stone he thought was gold. Now, he had to spend the rest of his life watching the happiness of others from a distance, while he himself continued to walk in place, trapped in an endless labyrinth of regret. Their story had ended with justice perfectly written by destiny.